talk about the rise of the Habsburgs. Habsburgs had different dynasties throughout Europe. Of course, the two most famous were the Spanish Habsburgs that controlled Spain to about 1700. And then the Austrian Habsburgs controlled pretty much the area around Austria-Hungary and that area in Central Europe up to about World War One. So we'll kind of talk about those two dynasties today. Like I said, I'm going to get started, of course, talking about the rise of the Habsburgs. Now, I'll first talk about Central Europe, kind of a little bit about that particular area of Europe at the time, which you can see right here. But in Central Europe, you start to see the rise of these different dynasties that kind of come to power. You do have the Hohenzollern dynasty. I'll kind of get later, which is in the northern part of Germany. But you got the Habsburgs, which are the ones we'll get mostly today, or in southern Germany, based around Austria. You also got the Spanish Habsburgs, which of course were in Spain as well. So we'll talk about that part of the dynasty, because Habsburgs had these two branches. One that was like a senior branch, the one in Spain, and then the one that was in the junior branch that was based around Austria, right there where Vienna is. But Hohenzollern dynasty, I'll kind of get to that later with the Prussians. They kind of form up in the north around Berlin and kind of right above Poland too, as well. Area called East Prussia, etc. And the Habsburgs had a vast empire. Of course, here's kind of a picture of the Habsburgs right there. And Habsburgs, their empire stretched, pretty much at one point around the world. They would have, pretty much a lot of territory in Europe that they would control, like around Spain, Portugal, around, Austria-Hungary, part of northern Italy at one point. But they did control parts of the New World, parts of the Pacific, Indian Ocean as well. And so their empires were quite vast, of course, in size. I think I've got a map showing you, by the way, the areas that they controlled at one point. The areas that are in red is more of the senior branch of the Habsburgs, which controlled a good bit of land, like most of Spain. Pretty much they controlled Portugal for a while, believe it or not, the Habsburgs. Parts of southern Italy, like around where Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, part of northern Italy at one point where Milan, as you can see. And also, Spanish Habsburgs also controlled territory around the Netherlands. In fact, the Dutch Republic at one point was part of the Spanish Empire. And then you've got the junior branch of the Habsburgs, of course, which is, you can see in yellow. That area is mostly the area that was, they kind of controlled like the Holy Roman Empire, because most of the Habsburg rulers were Holy Roman emperors for several centuries. But you can see they controlled territory, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Transylvania, also parts of northern Italy also as well. So their empire was quite vast, like I said, in size. Now, I'll kind of get into and first talk about the Spanish Empire, the Habsburg Spain. Of course, that would develop really from the 16th century up to about 1700. One of the first major rulers that you really hear about, of course, is Emperor Charles V, who's also was the king of Spain as well. They called him Carlos or Charles I as king of Spain. He was actually a grandson of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Remember them? We had talked about those rulers that had kind of backed Columbus's voyages to the New World. He's considered one of the greatest monarchs of the 16th century, like in the 1500s, because he controlled such vast lands throughout the world, which they think at one point was all like 5 continents, believe it or not. And kind of show you a map of, I guess, the Habsburg Empire, which usually the Habsburg Empire goes up from like around his reign, 1516, and it goes up to about 1700. So that's about almost 2 centuries that they control. But you can see the areas at one point that, at least under his son, I think in that map, it kind of shows Philip II, of course, his son that would come after would reign. But you can see all the territories they controlled in Europe. And you can see at the top left all the areas that the Spanish controlled too, like in the Americas, North America, South America. You can see parts of Africa, parts of India as well. Some of the Spanish even go as far as you can see close to the, like, and of course in the Philippines and all that too. So you can see it's almost pretty much on 5 continents. You're looking at that top left map right there. Now, yeah, they have different rulers. I'll kind of list them for later, and I'll kind of go through some of the different rulers that they had. But the Habsburg name goes back to Philip I, who was a Habsburg. He was actually a king at one point. King Philip I, they called him. And he was actually the husband of Joanna of Castile. They had a kind of a female ruler that they had as well. Joanna had a nickname. She was called Joanna the Mad because she kind of went mad for a while. And Joanna was the mother of Charles V, we're talking about. And you also got Charles, of course, there, Charles I, Charles V, Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, and then Charles II. So you see, those are all the different rulers. I guess in a sense they had about, you can see there, roughly about 6 Habsburg kings at one point that ruled over Spain. I think they called Philip I, they called him the fair or something like that, or the handsome. He was kind of good looking, but he was related back to the Habsburgs in Europe, of where the whole thing comes from. By the way, Charles V's empire, I've really heard about this before. Everybody's, talks about the British, how they used to say, the British, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Actually, it was the Spanish where that came from. They used to say that about the Spanish, their empire. The sun never set on the Spanish Empire because the empire was so vast. It was around the world at one point. And I think they say under Charles V's empire at one point, the empire peaked at like 1.5 million square miles, to kind of give you an idea of the size of it. And his empire, by the way, at the time was the largest empire since Emperor Charlemagne, who had ruled in the Middle Ages back in the 9th century, to kind of give you an idea how big it is. And that's just all the European possessions you're looking at that are there. That doesn't include, like, say, the New World and other parts of the world like Africa and Asia that they controlled. And, of course, the Philippines. And Guam, I think I told you about as well, was included as well in the Pacific. Of course, one of the things that would happen, if you know about it, eventually what occurred was Charles had a lot of health problems, and so he was forced to abdicate the throne. Philip, and of course, he would eventually give the Spanish throne over to his son, you see there, named King Philip II. And you'll see later, like, a lot of these kings of the Spanish or whatever have a lot of these health problems, congenital deformities, which they think were caused by inbreeding. They got the so-called Habsburg jaw. You see that with Philip II, kind of the jaw kind of sticking out bad right there. They had the kind of that problem with that. Also, another thing that happened was Charles V basically split his empire up. He split it in half. If you go back to that map I was showing you earlier, I can kind of bring it back up right here. But I think it's right here showing it. But eventually, he'll take, like, the Austrian lands you see there that are kind of around Austria and Hungary, et cetera, and he'll give those to his younger brother, whose name was Ferdinand I, who will become the Holy Roman Emperor afterwards. And so you get these 2 branches that split up afterwards. So you get a senior branch, the one in Spain, the Habsburgs, and then you get the junior branch, which, of course, is in the Austrian Empire, or monarchy, as they call it later, as well. And then his son, of course, who I was talking about a second ago, right here, well, not him, but his son, which is right here, Philip II. he'll become, of course, the king of Spain, basically. And I think he ruled over Naples and later, I think, Portugal at one point. And he had a nickname. He was called Philip the Prudent. By the way, he's the one, by the way, that the Philippines in the Pacific were later named after him. If you wonder about that. And he reigned during a period that's called the so-called Spanish Golden Age. It's kind of a peak of Spanish art and culture that peaked between the 16th and the 17th centuries. I think the Spanish called it the Golden Century, which kind of lasts between those two centuries. It was really the peak period of the Spanish Habsburg Empire, because later it starts declining and all that. And Philip was considered a big defender of the Catholic faith in Europe. He was big into the Counter-Reformation and trying to convert Europe back to Catholicism, like those Protestant states that had broken away. Philip, if you know about him, at one point was actually the husband of Queen Mary. Queen Mary the First, later known as Bloody Mary, who tried to basically convert Protestant England back to being Catholic. And so he later would actually try to invade England, so-called 1588 attack of the Spanish Armada, but his armada was wiped out, if you know about that. He was a defender of like Greece. They sometimes talk about the Battle of Lepanto on 1571, where his Spanish fleet helped basically defeat the Ottoman Turks that tried to invade Greece. And so he kind of protected that area of Europe from being invaded. There's some other rulers later. They have, I'll kind of just briefly talk about them, that were part of the Spanish Habsburgs as well. On the left, they have the ruler whose name is Philip III. He was known as the Pious. He reigned from 1598 to 1621, son of Philip II. It's really under him that the Spanish Empire starts declining, they believe, like especially by the early 17th century. Spain had a lot of problems later. They started to go bankrupt, believe it or not. They also suffered from like a lot of incidents, like bad harvests happened. There were like at least 3 outbreaks of bubonic plague, which killed several 100,000 people in Spain. And on top of that, everybody was leaving Spain to go to the New World or other parts of the Spanish Empire. And so you had this big brain drain that you had. And I think only Castile was really making any money. They had other parts of their empire which weren't really doing as well. And so the empires gets bigger, but it's just they start losing money and they're declining. And other powers like Britain and others are just better than they are. Then on the right, they have King Philip IV. He was called the Planet King. It's kind of a nickname. They dubbed him later. He lived more into the middle part of the 17th century, and he was actually the peak ruler of the Spanish Empire, even though it was declining. But the size of the Spanish Empire got up to like 4.7 million square miles by the time of his reign. Just kind of give you an idea of how big it was by then. Then there's, of course, the last of the Habsburgs that you have that reign in Spain, which is King Charles II, of course. He, of course, came in, and he's another reason why the empire declined. The fact that he was really an inept ruler. He was called the Bewitched, believe it or not, was one of his nicknames. He suffered from a lot of mental and physical problems, which deformities which were caused by inbreeding. And he's the one that's real famous for the so-called Habsburg jaw that you may have heard about. It's kind of like big jaw sticking out like that. And so a lot of these Habsburg rulers had that kind of problem from inbreeding, etc. But he was the last of the Habsburgs that ruled Spain. What happened was he gave the throne over to a cousin of his named Philip of Anjou, later known as King Philip V of Spain. And he was actually a grandson of Louis XIV, believe it or not. So you get this whole thing where Spain and France both are Bourbon, which was kind of a issue in Europe. And it actually sparked a big war later in the early 1700s called the War of the Spanish Succession, where the Habsburg, the Austrian junior branch over there, tried to get back the throne of Spain, but they end up losing it, and the Bourbons take it over, basically. So that's all because he didn't have any heirs and all that, and from all inbreeding and all that. And so Bourbon Spain kind of takes over. And I think the current monarchs of Spain are kind of descended back to the Bourbons today. I think it's King Carlos, I think is now in power now, of course. Now I'm going to move on to talk about, like I said, the Habsburgs, of course, that the junior branch, of course, which lasts longer. It goes up to like World War One that you have. And it's called different names. Of course, the common name that you'll sometimes see being used is the Austrian Empire, but it's got all kinds of names that they called it. Habsburg Empire, Habsburg Monarchy, I think are common names that you'll sometimes see being used for this multi-ethnic state, of course, that'll develop around where Austria is today, in what was, I guess, southern Germany or central southern area of Europe. You can see those are all the lands at one point they controlled in Europe: Austria-Hungary, Bohemia, Transylvania, part of northern Italy, the Netherlands. At one point they actually controlled as well. There's Emperor Leopold I on the left, who was probably one of their most famous rulers around that time when the empire starts really kind of emerging. It has other names too. Like later they call it the Austrian Empire, and then I think up to like the 19th and 20th century was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or simply just Austria-Hungary as well. That really had an official name, by the way, believe it or not. So I think Habsburg monarchy, I think, is the common name, or Habsburg Empire is usually what they prefer. It was a multi-ethnic empire. That's one of the things about it that's kind of different, I guess, in Europe. It was comprised of all kinds of different peoples, nationalities, different religions, mostly Catholic, but they had, Protestants and Jews and other groups that lived under them more than anything. I kind of show you basically the types of people that were there, but here's kind of a list, of all the different peoples that lived under their empire at one point. Germans and Hungarians were the main ones that really had the most power overall. But you had people that were Czechs, Moravians, Slovaks, people from Poland like Poles, Slovenes, Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, Romanians, Italians, and of course also some Jews too as well that lived pretty much all throughout that area. It's part of why the empire broke up, especially after World War One, because you got all these different countries now that kind of are in that area now. They're kind of broken up from that main state that was there. Now, I'm going to, of course, talk about Emperor Leopold I, who you see, of course, in that image. Of course, I'll get to the Battle of Vienna, which is probably one of his famous things he was kind of involved in, but he was one of their greatest rulers, really, that reigned in the 17th century. 46 years, I guess, of the direct descendant of the Habsburgs in that region. He was one of the longest reigning, so close to 46 years he was in power. All these Habsburg rulers had multiple titles. So Habsburgs at one point, I think for at least 300 years or more, controlled the position of Holy Roman Emperor, which was an elected position in Germany. And he was Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia. I think later he became King of Transylvania as well. And one of his greatest successes was really expanding the Habsburg Empire at the time. I think they talk about his greatest success really was his victories over the Ottoman Empire, which was threatening parts of Central Eastern Europe. So-called Great Turkish War, or some people call it the Habsburg Ottoman War, which took place between 1683 to 1699. And at one point in 1683, the Turks laid siege to Vienna, which lasted over, I think, 2 months. And he was instrumental, Leopold, in forming an alliance, which was called later the Holy League, which got countries like Russia involved. I think Peter the Great was one of the rulers that was kind of instrumental in that. Poland, Lithuania, which had a king named Jan Sobieski, who you see on the right in that image right there. He was involved in it, and this was a pro-Christian alliance to try and push the Ottoman Empire out of Eastern Europe. And I think because of mostly Jan Sobieski, they were able to eventually lift the siege, which this Battle of Vienna was considered, I think, one of the most famous battles associated with the Great Turkish War, September 12th, 1683. And a combined force of mostly Polish forces, believe it or not, led by Sobieski, routed the Turks, helping to lift the siege. I think it was one of the largest cavalry charges in history, the Battle of Vienna, I think involving 18,000 troops. And so with that, from there, the Habsburgs in that part of Central Europe were able to then gobble up territory from the Ottoman Empire. They seized control of Transylvania, Slovenia, as well, which is close to Italy, and then part of Croatia. They take over that too as well on the Treaty of Karlowitz. And so from there, you see the Habsburgs begin expanding their empire. But a lot of the Habsburg Empire was mostly gotten through a combination of war, but also through different marriages, like in pretty much in that part of Europe. So intermarriage and things like that of different nobility. Another thing about Leopold, I guess, that's kind of famous about him, he was involved in a lot of alliances he formed against Louis XIV. He kind of checked Louis XIV's power. Leopold and him were like first cousins. They're kind of related to each other. And Louis XIV in the late 17th century and early 18th century attempted to expand his empire in mostly Germany. And so it led to a bunch of conflicts like the 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, which had all kinds of names. I think some people call it the War of the Grand Alliance, I think was another name. And I think in England, they call it the War of the English Succession, because William the Third had taken over the throne from King James II. And then they had the War of the Spanish Succession as well, where I told you where the Habsburgs tried to get back Spain from the Bourbons, but it ended up failing in the end. So he was kind of instrumental in forming a lot of these alliances. I think originally they called it the League of Augsburg or something like that, but throughout Europe it was called the Grand Alliance. Of course, the other thing that the Habsburgs were very famous for, which you saw in that little video, they had this famous palace, which was a summer palace, really, of the Habsburgs, which is called Schönbrunn, and became their main central court, where they ruled from pretty much up to like World War I that they had. The actual name in German means beautiful well or beautiful spring because of a nearby artesian well that's on the site. Here's some other images, of course, of Schönbrunn right here. They believe it started in the 16th century as a mansion that was used as a hunting ground for the Emperor Maximilian II. Then from there, they began to expand it, I think right after the Great Turkish Wars, when they began to really build what you're looking at right there in the image of the Palace of Schönbrunn. And it is kind of a late Baroque style architect that kind of mirrored some of the other palaces that were being built, like similar to what you saw at Versailles. Other palaces, of course, were built like in Germany, in Russia, that are kind of similar. It's known for a lot of its rooms. It has 1,441 rooms in it. I think one of the last rulers to reign from it was the ruler, which was Franz Joseph I, who I think lived in the whole palace pretty much his whole life, believe it or not. It was later remodeled. We know about this Maria Theresa, who later pretty much reigned from it. And so did, I told you, Emperor Francis Joseph I. They pretty much were the ones that remodeled it, and that's the way it looks today, the facade on it now, like on the outside of Schönbrunn. It is a major tourist attraction in Vienna. I know before COVID, at one point, the amount of people that were visiting it was something like 8 million. I'm sure it's dropped off since then. I know Versailles, it was double, like 15, 16 million were visiting Versailles. I don't know what it is now. I think it's dropped off pretty good because of COVID. It is known for its gardens. Like some of their formal gardens are sometimes called the Great Parterre. And it was actually designed by this protege of André Le Nôtre, we talked about at Versailles, who built a lot of the gardens and parks there, Jean Triet. He was the guy that designed it and all that. And you saw in the image that it is known for its zoo. It's usually called the Schönbrunn Zoo or Tiergarten Schönbrunn, which has pretty much been there since 1752. So that's one of the oldest zoos that's still working, of course, today. Here's kind of some of the interior. So a lot of these, palaces were kind of like Versailles, highly decorative, gold, marble, and tapestries, of course, on the ceiling, like you saw before. All pretty much designed similar to that. Some other rulers they had of the Habsburg monarchy that were real famous was they had Emperor Charles VI. He was one of the sons of Emperor Leopold. He reigned from 1711 to 1740. He had a brother that reigned briefly for a few years, who was Joseph I, but he died of smallpox. And so he came into power afterwards. And the only thing about Charles VI, he didn't have any sons, and this became a real major problem to the Habsburgs. He was like the last direct male descendant of the Habsburg monarchy, and he only had 2 daughters. And so what happened was in 1713, you can see there, he issued this thing called the Pragmatic Sanction. And what it did was it allowed for a female heir to inherit the Habsburg monarchy's lands, something they'd never done before. And I think under German laws a lot, like going back to the Franks, and they call it the so-called Salic law, only a male can inherit lands and become like a monarch. And so you really only have one ruler later that's a female ruler, which will be his daughter, which is Maria Theresa, who, of course, will come in later and be the ruler. So there's Charles VI. Charles VI, by the way, I think his father tried to put him on the throne of Spain at one point during the whole War of the Spanish Succession, but it failed. So I think at one point he wanted to be the king of Spain, but it didn't work out. There's Maria Theresa. Of course, she's like I said, the only female ruler that the Habsburg monarchy had. She is considered, by the way, to be one of the greatest rulers of modern Europe, especially around the 18th century. She's up there with pretty much Catherine the Great, who reigns around the same time as Maria Theresa does. She had multiple titles, like a lot of these Habsburg rulers had. She was known as the Queen of Bohemia, Archduchess of Austria, the Queen of Hungary. Later, she became Holy Roman Empress because of her marriage. I think it was a cousin of hers named Emperor Francis I, who was known as Francis Stephen of Lorraine, and so she got the actual title of Empress because of that. Sometimes she'll be called Empress Maria Theresa. However, she's the one that had all the real power. Then you get this image right here showing, I think, her with her husband, I think who's on the bottom left there, right there, Francis Stephen of Lorraine. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, but in reality, she's the one that had the real power because she, controlled all the lands and all that. And so he was kind of like a figurehead as emperor. He was emperor for about 20 years of the Holy Roman Empire. But like I said, she actually wielded all the actual power. So that's her, of course, and her family you see on the right. They had a lot of children, her and Francis, 16 children, by the way, at one point. 11 girls and 11 boys. And at one point, it became known later as the so called Habsburg Lorraine dynasty or House of Habsburg Lorraine. So it kind of continued the Habsburg dynasty up to like World War One. Some people call it Habsburg for short, but that's the official name of it because they kind of took up, the father's name. They sometimes even just call it Lorraine Dynasty, like for short. But I guess they kept the Habsburg thing in there sometimes because of the Habsburgs, of course, there. But they were known for having a lot of children. I'll kind of give you at least three rulers that were kind of famous that were part of the Habsburg monarchy that they had. They had, of course, Emperor Joseph II, I'll talk about later, was one of the most famous sons, of course, of Maria Theresa. He was kind of controversial. I'll get to him in a second. He also, Joseph II had a brother named Leopold II, who only reigned for like a few years, but he was also emperor as well. And then, of course, you may have heard of Marie Antoinette. Of course, one of Maria Theresa's most famous daughters. She would go on, to, of course, to be the Queen of France a little later. I'll kind of talk about some things that she's kind of known for, by the way, Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa, by the way, was known as a enlightened despot. She was kind of known for making a lot of reforms to her state because if you study about around the 18th century, you start seeing these absolutists that believe in state reforms and trying to modernize the state overall. And examples of some of the reforms that Maria Theresa was kind of known for. Well, she centralized the Habsburg crown even more, but she began to modernize their empire. She began to, if you know about Austria, they eventually adopt German as the main language. Kind of controversial later, I know, because you have other people like Hungarians that, of course, don't like that much with that. She created a council of state, which was a group of advisors that advised her, even though she was really an absolutist type ruler. She revamped their educational systems. You start to see this in like there in Prussia, where they create more secular type education overall. She did have a civil law code system, which she adopted to, which was called the Codex Teresianus, of course, which was kind of popular. And I think in Prussia they had something similar to that as well. That Frederick the Great developed, like another type of code. But a lot of these early codes like that are going to be kind of influential to, like the Napoleonic Code that they'll have, of course, later. Now, she did have this rival I usually talk about that I'll kind of get to later with the Prussians. But she had Frederick the Great, who was in Prussia and northern Germany. They both came to power, by the way, at the same time, which is kind of weird in 1740. But Frederick, his father, Frederick William I, who was sometimes called the Soldier King, he had been forming this real big army in the north. The Prussians are known for their traditional military and so on. And so it spawned a bunch of wars because Frederick wanted this area called Silesia that was south of Prussia, which you see in that red area on the bottom. And Silesia was rich in like minerals, natural resources, and things like that. And so he invaded it and it sparked a bunch of wars that were called the Silesian Wars in Germany. And it sparked a big war in Europe called the War of the Austrian Succession because some powers didn't really want Maria Theresa to be on the throne because she's a woman. And so that became a major conflict. And she hated him, by the way. I think there was a deal where Frederick, I think at one point, wanted to marry her, and kind of merge the two dynasties, Hohenzollern dynasty in Prussia and the Habsburgs, in the south. But she couldn't stand him. I think she said at one point, "That evil man," I think is what she called him. And I think she tried to get Silesia back, but it later failed. She tried twice, too, even in the 7 Years' War later. Then they have Emperor Joseph II, who you see in that picture. He, of course, reigned pretty much coded with his mother, Maria Theresa. He was emperor from 1765 to 1790 over the Holy Roman Empire, and then after his mother died, he kind of ruled by himself, I think, for about 10 years, 1780 to 1790. He was very prolific as an enlightened despot. In fact, he's considered one of the most famous enlightened despots. In fact, his reforms were considered so radical for the time that people called it Josephinism, kind of got named after him and all that. And kind of list a bunch of reforms that he was kind of known for right there. But you can see in 1781, he abolished serfdom, which they start doing this in Europe, like in Germany and Prussia. Frederick the Great gets rid of it also as well. Freedom of religion and civic rights are given to Protestants and Jews. They had this thing called the Patents of Toleration were issued, 1781 for Protestants and 1782 for Jews. And you start to see Jews being emancipated in that part of Europe and Germany as well. So this is all because of the Enlightenment going on at the time. Freedom of the press was something else he did. He reformed the judicial system, sought it to make it more equal for all citizens. He abolished torture and the death penalty. That was kind of interesting about that. That's something he did with things. Not many people did that. I think Frederick the Great did that in Prussia at one point as well. Expanded state schools, so schools start to be more, secular, like I said. Established hospitals, insane asylums, poorhouses, orphanages, and things like that as well. Also, Joseph was big into like music, and if you know about it, Mozart, heard of Mozart at the time, came to the Schönbrunn Palace and became his court composer on things like that. And the only thing was he was kind of critical towards Mozart. And I think there was one play he did one time where he said, Mozart, I'm sorry, but that music has got too many notes in it or something like that. He told him. That's kind of famous about that. But yeah, he loved Mozart. Thought he was a great musician, of course. And of course, today, Mozart, classical composer and all that. So now they have other rulers after Joseph died in 17. There's Marie Antoinette, by the way. I didn't show her, but that's the sister, of Emperor Joseph II that you got as well. She would later be, of course, the queen of France. She later was married to King Louis XVI, who both those died on the guillotine on the French Revolution. So she's kind of a tragic, queen. Of course, later what happens to her, but she was supposed to be very beautiful, by the way, Marie Antoinette. There's Francis the second. He's, of course, one of the later emperors that comes in that you have. Yeah, they have these other emperors they have as well. They did have Leopold II, by the way, who came in 1790 to 92, who was like his like a brother of Joseph II, but he died young, 1792. So the throne went to Francis here, who was a nephew of basically of Joseph II. I think that was the son of Leopold II. But anyway, he was the last Holy Roman Emperor. They would have no more after 1806 because Napoleon Bonaparte basically just conquered Europe and decided that they didn't need this empire anymore, and so he broke it up. And so, yeah, he's considered the last Holy Roman Emperor that you have. And what happens later is that it's kind of confusing about this second Francis that you have, but Francis II later becomes known as the Emperor of Austria. He'll become Francis I in 1806. That begins the so-called Austrian Empire. They sometimes call it afterwards, from 1806 to 1867. So you won't have that title anymore of Holy Roman Emperor. So it kind of died out, being used pretty much. Yeah, it's under him and some of these other rulers that you really get, the peak of the Austrian Empire overall. I kind of show you this map here, but eventually by the 19th century, the empire starts to get pretty vast. They call it later the so-called Austro-Hungarian Empire. as they call it. That's the actual common name that you'll start to really see, which will be used, I guess, up to about 1918, or some people call it for short, like I said, Austria-Hungary as well. It breaks up because of World War One, because they end up allying with the German Empire during the war. The Central Powers end up losing, World War One, and it breaks up, afterwards. They did have a bunch of later rulers that were part of the um, Austro-Hungarian Empire. Besides France is the first, the Austrian emperor. They had Ferdinand the First, Franz Joseph the First. They had Charles the First, who I think only ruled for a couple of years at the end of World War One as well. They did have titles. Sometimes they would call them like I think Emperor King was, I think, one of the nicknames that they would actually call it. In this one, this ruler right here that you're looking at was really considered one of the greatest rulers of the later Austro-Hungarian Empire, who reigned, by the way, between the 19th and 20th centuries. He had one of the longest reigning rulers of Europe. Like he reigned like 67 years and almost, you can see almost 68. He was like, I guess, 10 days short of 68 years at one point. And yeah, it's his nephew we'll get to later when I talk about World War One, but he had this nephew that was supposed to be the ruler after he died, which was Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, but he was killed in 1914, and so it helped spark World War One. And so that's another reason I think why the empire declined, because he didn't have a good heir, I think, that came in afterwards. But I think at one point that this particular ruler we're talking about is really the most famous ruler, probably the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty, that we have later, but he's the sixth longest reigning monarch of all time. So almost 68 years that he actually reigns. Now I'm going to be getting later into some other, we'll get into like talking about the rise of Prussia. You got Frederick the Great, of course, that you've got later. Kingdom of Prussia kind of will emerge in the north, and Prussia will evolve into the German Empire. So we'll kind of talk about that as well. And then also the Russians. The Russian absolutism, the Russian Empire will also merge as well with the Rurik and the Romanov dynasties as well. So those are kind of different dynasties and empires I'll kind of talk about later that we have overall. I'm thinking of actually doing recorded lectures on that for those, because probably next week I'll have y'all's first exam coming up, which I'm thinking Monday likely will be it, because I know we got Mardi Gras coming up, and I need to get some kind of exam in before Mardi Gras is here, because I think right at the beginning of March is when Mardi Gras starts, or really ends, I guess, for us at that time. So anyway, I think that's about it for today. I don't think we had anybody else that had any comments today, like questions or anything like that. But if y'all have any comments, questions, of course, about my lecture, y'all can always leave comments, of course, on my channel. Or if you got a question about the class, you can also email me as well. Don't forget, you do have some assignments out there, of course, Conquest of America, of course, that quiz. I think it's due Friday, I want to say, is when it is. And then, of course, you've got the first vocab assignment due, I think, starting this coming weekend as well. Just kind of remind you about these assignments. And you do have a discussion, I think, going on now about the study guide questions. I think the ones on the Bourbons are on the Bourbon Absolute is pretty much still right there if you want to work on those. I'll send out reminders about it as well. So y'all have a great day. Yeah, have a great day, Natalie, as well. And so I'll see y'all, of course, later next week. So y'all take care and have a great weekend coming up. So see y'all later.